Welcome to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and this is my 3D printed Undercity from the Battle for Baldur's Gate Magic the Gathering set. I tried a lot of new things on this project, some of which didn't turn out great, but before getting into that, I want to give you some backstory. I started playing Magic as a teenager and got really into it around the time of original Innistrad. I played Standard for a few months, although I was limited to a teenager's budget, and I played Limited every week for quite a while. I stopped playing during college, but got back into it through Twitch streamers and built a few commander decks which I use maybe a few times a year. I still consider myself a fan, and I've attempted a few projects related to the game in past, but I've never posted any of them because they haven't turned out well, at least not until now. Over the past year or two, I haven't been following the game particularly closely, but I will occasionally look up the latest set to see what's going on. That's how I found out about Forgotten Realms, a few months after it came out. I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons as a teenager and thought it was a great idea. I bought myself a gift box as a treat, which I never got around to opening. This pretty well sums up my relationship with the game at this point. I really like the dungeon mechanic and thought it would be cool to 3D print miniature D&D dungeons for each of these cards. I've been interested in 3D printing D&D figures and terrain for a few years, but I haven't had the time to invest in it or the opportunity to use anything I did end up printing. So this seemed like the perfect opportunity for me. I was going to make these all look like an old book, with a fake leather cover and everything, so I'd have a needlessly cool accessory whenever this came up. I 3D printed the 3 dungeons from the original Forgotten Realms set, and finished nearly everything about them before giving up. Like the Overlord bells I posted a few months ago, this project got delayed because I moved last year. By the time I got it unpacked and ready to work on, I had already improved so much that finishing these seemed pointless. I made these back when I was only using OpenSCAD, my sanding game wasn't great, and I was still priming things by smothering them with large amounts of white acrylic paint instead of using a nice spray-on primer. I did a few innovative things with this project, like this was the first time I used clay sculpting tools to help apply wood filler to 3D prints, and it would have been a great thing to post several months ago, but not now. I'm trying to push myself to do better in each video, and posting this would have been like going several steps back. I've been kinda bummed about this for a while, because I love the concept and I've been looking for a chance to redeem this project. For this month, I actually already had a project planned, printed, and ready to start sanding, but then I looked up the most recent Magic spoilers and saw the Battle for Baldur's Gate Undercity. It seemed perfect, so I got to work. I modeled this several times in Blender. I haven't done anything like this before, and I was pretty particular about the results. For instance, when I finally got the exterior walls looking good, I realized they wouldn't meet up with the interior walls nicely, so I remade it entirely. I definitely spent as much time on this as I have some of my more elaborate daggers. I'm not too upset though, because this was a very new type of project for me. I view this as an investment, and when I do another project like this in future, I think it will go much faster because I got a lot of my dumb beginner mistakes out of the way. One mistake I want to highlight was a basic issue with mirroring. Mirroring is great for something like this because you can make 1/4 of the floor and then copy it in the X and Y directions to create the entire floor. It saves a bunch of time, but it relies on the object's origin, the point where these copies start from, being in the right place. In my case, this should have been in the center, but that didn't happen because I was combining a lot of meshes together. The solution took only 2 clicks, but it did take me a frustratingly long time to find the answer on Google because I didn't know the right search terms. Issues like this are pretty common when you're self-taught, because you didn't go through a lengthy course which taught you all the basics. It's annoying when it does come up, but the way I see it, diving in and making stuff was still a much better choice for me than starting with some boring course. Another thing I want to point out is the size of these gaps. I made sure they were all around 2 mm, so my tools could get in there. A 1 mm gap would have been impossible for me to work with unless I ordered a bunch of new files. Eventually I had this looking good, but then I couldn't get it to be manifold. Normally I just let Repetier Host repair my models, but it couldn't handle this one. I resorted to repairing individual pieces of this, like the tiles on the floor, and then importing them back into Blender. There were a few pieces that just weren't cooperating, and I had to remodel in a more intelligent way. Eventually, I got everything finished and divided up. I feel like I say this on every project, especially the ones you haven't seen yet because they are currently a disaster, but the next time I'm 3D modeling something, I'm going to pay more attention to how I'll divide it up for printing. Printing this was a pain. The bed wasn't level, and I spent several hours over 2 days getting this working again. I didn't level the frame when I was building this years ago, because I didn't know what I was doing and the parts in the kit were of inconsistent lengths, so this isn't the best 3D printer ever. There's not much I can do about it now without disassembling it, which I'm not going to do because I have a whole bunch of 3D printer parts which have been sitting in a box for months, waiting to be assembled into a new 3D printer. I'll cover the upgrades I've made to this printer, as well as building that new printer in different videos. Eventually, I shimmed the bed up with some folded paper and made a bunch of other little fixes. I don't feel great about these, but whatever works. Needlessly long story short, I nearly cried when this was finally working again. My significant other was looking at me like I was crazy, but I think a few other makers out there can probably relate to this experience. When I 3D printed the bottom of the dungeon, it had a cup to it. I used a heat gun and some straight bits of wood to bend this flat, but I wouldn't recommend that approach to others. I had some issues taking the supports out. I ended up damaging some of these bricks, but I chalked it up to free texturing. I don't want this dungeon to look too perfect, not that that's ever a possibility with my prints. For sanding, I started with the Dremel tool. The sanding bit did a great job smoothing out the edges. I tried to use smaller bits to clear out the gaps between the bricks, but plastic melted to these. Cleaning this will be a problem for future Kevin to figure out. My small files were the MVP of this project. Like I mentioned earlier, I intentionally made the gaps between the tiles and bricks large enough for these to fit in between. This made a huge difference, and I can't even imagine doing this project without that. I applied a round of wood filler before attaching the pieces together. My hope was that I could do 80 to 90% of the work at this stage, before everything was attached together and harder to work with, and then just apply a little bit of wood filler to cover up the join. I sanded everything with sandpaper and my trusty files. I attached everything together with 2-part epoxy in a couple of stages. I started with the exterior walls and put some weights on this to try to ensure a good connection. One section of the wall didn't sit right, so I had to go back and try attaching this again. Once the exterior walls were all finished, I moved on to the interior walls, which I got correct in my first try. Then I applied another round of wood filler to cover up the joins. This wasn't as controlled as I'd hoped, so I ended up having a lot more sanding to do. Towards the end of the sanding, I broke a bit of the wall off. I mixed up some 2-part epoxy and glued it back on, but I didn't add any additional wood filler. By this point, I was sick and tired of sanding, so I'm just going to chalk this up to adding more character to the dungeon. Finally, I moved on to spray-on primer. This highlighted a bunch of little imperfections, like stringing between some of the bricks, which I addressed with a knife. One really scary thing was that one of my blades actually snapped while I was working on this and went flying across the room. I always wear breathing protection when I'm working with anything dusty, but starting with my next project, I'm going to incorporate a face shield of some kind. Moments like this really make you reevaluate. After a few more rounds of primer, I was ready to paint this. I opted for some dark gray paint I bought for the original project. Anyone who has painted tabletop terrain before is probably cringing at this. Normally you would make this stuff out of foam, and you would paint the tiles slightly different colors to add some variety. I'm not doing that on this project, and if you know how this process normally works, you're probably going to hate the next step. Next, I mixed some black wash, which is a dark watery mixture which is used to darken the details of terrain and give it a more weathered look. This is normally a mixture of several things, and there are some great recipes online. I didn't have most of the ingredients, so I mixed some gray paint, black paint, and water. My first batch was way off, so I mixed a second one using less water. After brushing this dark mixture on, I used a paper towel to dab it off, which left the darker paint in the cracks and crevices. Since this mixture was water-based, it took off some of the dark gray acrylic paint and exposed some of the lighter primer underneath. It won't win any awards, but I'm satisfied with it considering it's my first attempt at terrain painting. There's definitely things I would do differently next time, but that's to be expected whenever you're making something that's totally new for you. If you're planning to try making this yourself, I highly recommend you find some real tutorials and do the process properly. One feature I really wanted to include in this was a marker to track your progress, which was held in place using magnets. For the original version, I included holes in the bottom to fit these. I didn't bother with that on this version and just epoxied the magnets directly onto the bottom. This gave me an uneven surface, so I kinda wish I embedded them like I did the last time. The entire process was totally unnecessary for this project, but the best details always are. I ended up using the markers I made for the original version. These are crude ones I made in OpenSCAD with a little hollow in the bottom where I epoxied a magnet. I tried making a new, much more elaborate marker for this which included the set symbol, but there was no way I could finish that this month. When I was epoxying the magnets onto the bottom of this, I used the marker to help ensure they were in the right position and oriented correctly. I have no idea how it happened, but I got the orientation wrong on one of these magnets and had to go back and redo it. It is so much easier to work with small pieces when they have a magnet embedded in them. I put a magnet inside of this cup, and it made the whole priming and painting process way easier. While the dungeon was drying, I started on the book wrapping. For the exterior, I'm using some faux leather I got from Joann's. This is one of their cheaper varieties, and it was less than 10 bucks a yard on clearance. I wanted to use some material that was better than cardboard to form the stiff covers of this book. One Amazon package I got happened to have this corrugated plastic, so I hung onto it and used it here. I cut 1 centimeter beyond the edge of the dungeon, so there would be a bit of an overhang to protect this from damage. Afterwards, I glued everything together using tacky glue, because I read online it was the best for fabric. I haven't done enough projects like this to have my own opinion though. Funny story though, I actually messed all of this up. I had a really late work event the following day, and I normally go to bed quite early because of the hours I work, so I was genuinely worried about nodding off during this event. I stayed up much later than usual so I could sleep in, and figured I would spend that time working on this. I ended up messing up the measurements and a few other things because I was so tired, so I started over from scratch the next day. I was out of corrugated plastic by this point, so I just used cardboard, which ended up bonding way better with the glue. I started by gluing everything to some white muslin I had lying around from a past project, which let me confirm it folded properly. That was one of the mistakes I made on my last attempt. I applied the faux leather and paid very careful attention to the corners, which was another thing I messed up on my first attempt. I did a passable job here, but I'm not going to be giving advice on this anytime soon. If you want to make your own, I recommend looking up a much better tutorial. One thing about the gluing which surprised me was how satisfying tacky glue is to work with. I'm used to using 2-part epoxy, which requires significant safety precautions. Meanwhile, I could eat this glue, and the worst that would happen is I would get a stomachache. It was a very nice change. The felt I used for this is actually something I bought 10 years ago, and rediscovered while clearing some of my stuff out of my parents' basement. I hate throwing away usable material, so I chose to use it for this project, and it worked really well. I was going to use purple felt for this, but I think the black felt matches the color palette of the dungeon much better. This turned out pretty well, but one thing I wasn't expecting was that its default state was going to be open. You can shut it, but it requires pressure. If I were doing this again, I would probably add a clasp or a tie to keep this closed. While I was working on the book cover portion of this, I applied a matte spray-on clear coat to the dungeon and let it dry. I ended up using 2-part epoxy to attach the dungeon to the felt. Felt is pretty easy to mess up when you're gluing, and I didn't want to have to attempt this multiple times. Tacky glue might have worked, but I knew that 2-part epoxy would definitely do the job. I also added a bit of felt to the bottom of the marker, just to be fancy. I'm quite happy with this project. I had hoped to add more details, like miniature furniture and labels for each room, but it just wasn't in the cards for this version. It's not the best thing I ever made, but I knew it wasn't going to be when I started. I got to do something topical related to a game that I love, I managed to redeem a project which had fallen short in past, and it gave me a chance to try modeling tabletop terrain. I plan to model more terrain in future, hopefully after I start playing Dungeons & Dragons again, so this was a very successful experiment. I posted the files on Thingiverse in case you want to make your own. I'll put a link in the video description. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like so YouTube's algorithm will recommend this to more people. If you want to support the channel and see more of my projects, then please subscribe.